There we go. So, Oana, thanks a lot for joining us today. Really, really happy that we made it to make this work. Um, we normally start with every guest that we have on the podcast, assuming that most of our listeners don't know them. So, with a simple question of who is Oana?
What do you mean people don't know me? No, I'm kidding. So, Oana is a person coming from Romania originally, born in Bucharest, but grew up in a very small village, 3,000 people. Everybody knew me, I knew everybody. Not the funnest time. But I moved abroad about 10 years ago. I worked in talent acquisition for the past 15 years, mostly technology recruitment, Dublin, Amsterdam, Paris, Berlin, and what else? Barcelona now. But recently I put a hat of entrepreneur, solopreneur, whatever you want to call it, doing DEI consulting and DEI interventions. And it's a very, very fun ride. So I'm sure we're going to get into more things, but this is in a nutshell who Oana is.
Very nice. And indeed, I think that's a common thread for Romanians coming from the countryside. Both Andre and myself were from Romania. I was born in a city there, but then we moved with my parents to a relatively small village. I mean, they say it's a district close to a city, but in the end, it's a village because there were cows close by. So it is a village. And now looking back, it has its magic. But in the moment when you're in it, you're like, how can I get out of it as soon as possible? At least that was my experience. I don't know about you.
True. I think now looking back, I think this is the best type of childhood that one could have, especially when you're like pre-adolescent, let's say so, because you're super free. And I am very grateful for the connection to nature, the understanding of, the animal world and some of these things. My parents were very curious people as well, are very curious people, so they showed me around stuff. And there was also work in a way. You work when you are a kid in the countryside. There's always something to do, so there's a certain appetite to get things done, to get things done right, to have a certain program or discipline. But also then when it's relaxed time, it's really relaxed time, and I appreciated that. Yes.
And you're connected with nature, with the elements, you're in tune because you have to, whatever you do, and you know everyone and everyone knows you, which is a good
Yes.
thing and not necessarily a good thing. Did you always know that you wanted to, move, not necessarily abroad, but at least, to move away from there? Because for me, that was initially my experience. I wanted to go study in the UK. And then I was like, okay, well, if it's not the UK, at least somewhere close to that. Was it the same for you or a different path?
I think so. I think I didn't necessarily have a specific plan, or, I was 7 and I was dreaming about this. Not really, but there was not really another choice, if I'm being honest. In order to have a healthy, sustainable income and life and option in life, you had to get out. There is no high school in my village, so I had to travel for high school. I lived out, separated from my family 5 days a week to actually attend high school. And then for university, I went to Bucharest. That's, you have three choices: Iași, Cluj, or Bucharest. For those listening from Romania, there are maybe Brașov nowadays, but back then it was not really an option. But I think I always wanted to go further. I didn't have something in mind, a certain destination, abroad or not abroad, but there were very frequent times where I was like, this is not enough anymore. Next, right? And yeah, I think this is still happening.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that because it looks like you're still doing it nowadays also. How do you make the decisions to move from one city to another? 'Cause that's something
Ooh,
interesting. Yeah.
that's a whole different conversation. um, every decision was different, but I'll give you the first decision. So moving to Dublin, because I think this is a very practical way I approach things. Moving back then, I was 25, 26, and I knew I already worked in talent acquisition technology. I had a decent level of skill, a decent level of English. I had some kind of ambitious, and I was good at it, to be honest. But back then there were language limitations, right? So I did my top three and I put Amsterdam, Berlin, and Dublin. I didn't really want very big cities like London, for example, Daniel. I think that was very brave to kind of aim there. For me, I was like, ooh, that's too big. But back then, Amsterdam and Berlin, any type of jobs for recruiters were asking the local language. So very quickly, I got eliminated. It's not that I eliminated the locations, but I were just not cutting it through, right? And somebody in Dublin, shout out to Stel Fox and Eugene and Steve, who gave me a chance. And they're like, well, this little kid here might actually do some work in this environment. And it was a wonderful experience for me because Dublin, it is a little bit of a village. It is English speaking, so it got me very quickly in the work culture, understanding what needs to be done, and without having the language barrier. And I think later on, the years passed, in both Amsterdam, both Berlin, when I ended up working in the end, they liberalized a little bit. They started learning that international talent and working in English is not the end of the country, and we do need this type of talent. So in a way, then it became a little bit easier to have access to this type of opportunities. But the language principle was very important at the beginning when I decided to make this move.
I think it still applies even today. A lot of times, and if you think about it, it makes sense because it's a higher risk, and also if someone speaks the local language, potentially they're already here. So the companies want to, go for whatever is easier, quicker, and safer for them. And so first you landed in Dublin, and you worked in an agency, coming from an agency in Romania, if I remember correctly, right? So it was basically from a local agency to a international agency. How was that? So how was, landing in Dublin from a recruitment agency perspective? What were your first cultural shocks and also work-related shocks?
Wow, I need to go very way back. First of all, there is a very interesting difference when I think I talk for entire Eastern Europe and entire Western Europe when it comes to tech, like especially technical recruitment and recruitment in general, agency-wise. In the West, my realization, which I didn't really have any estimate about it before, is that it's mainly done by guys. While recruitment in Eastern Europe, especially in Romania, where I come from, is mainly done by girls, women, right? So for me, it was I was coming from a women manager, mainly my customers, right? Like my clients. I was working with Vodafone. I was working with some Genpact, some like big corporations in Romania. My hiring parties, let's say partners, were also women because I was working with the HR in those companies. Then I end up in Dublin, where it was an agency of about 30 men. We were 2, 3 women, I think, by the end when I left. Mostly very young, and my clients were also mostly men. And somehow I think I adapted very well, but it wasn't easy for everybody. Like I had people who had challenges adapting to this environment because it's more sales driven versus
Right.
the candidate nurturing relationship that I would say we do more in the East. And in the same time, there were also other factors that you had to adapt very quickly. I'm gonna be honest a little bit here. I thought I would be an alcoholic because there's such a drinking culture, especially in young agencies back then. I think this is changing. I think we are moving into a different direction. But I did kind of took it upon me to integrate. So the first 3 months, I was religiously going to all the social events my colleagues were having because I was like, otherwise I won't learn who they are and how they do things. And then I said, okay, I'm in, and I withdrew. But I think this for me were like two different shocks when it comes to work. The gender makeup and the conversations are just very different, so you kind of need to adapt, and then also what people do after work. So yeah.
I can already picture the three-piece suit, slick hair.
Yes. I still have like
And Guinness drinking.
Exactly. Check this out. I have a banned LinkedIn account to this day because I cannot access it anymore. But if you search Oana Iordachescu on LinkedIn, there are 2 accounts. One, which is the current one, and the one with I have a suit, a blue suit, a picture that I took in Stevens Park in Dublin, paid by the company because that's what the image was that everybody had. And because I was spamming a lot, I got banned. So it's still there. It's a good memory.
And were you the only woman in the team?
We were 3, one Polish, myself, and a Hungarian. And I think I stayed the most, but within a year I moved to Facebook, now Meta.
I
And
think
how was that? How was that transition from agency to in-house, and especially at such a renowned company as Meta?
You know what? It's back then I didn't want to go internal. I was like, oh, it's so boring. They do the same thing over and over again. And me in agency, I get to work with, I was working back then with TripAdvisor, with Activision Blizzard. I also went in like in embedded with Activision Blizzard, and with all the Call of Duty and all the hype with the gaming back then. It was really interesting to see. So I enjoyed. I know this is not a very common approach, but I enjoyed my agency days. I think the learning curve is really interesting, and I was lucky for good managers, to be honest. And they listened to me. I was pretty crap at business development, and they gave me key accounts, and I was very good at that. So I cared about DEI since then. So I was working with these key accounts to bring more women engineers, which was quite special. So it was very important for me to do this work right, but also for them it was very interesting because there was somebody who actually cared about doing it like that, right? But back then it was such a big hype, and Dublin was very active. You had Google, LinkedIn, Twitter, Meta in the same, it's called the docks. So it's exactly the same space around the water, and all the offices are there. I remember a party I went with a friend, and the main question of the night was like, are you LinkedIn, Google, or Facebook? And I'm like, neither.
which of the many?
Yeah, like everybody was part of this ecosystem. But I was headhunted. I really loved the interviews with Facebook back then. The scope was super interesting. So I jumped in. I think I don't know. I loved, especially then I was doing a lot of very deep technical recruitment, and I didn't necessarily feel a big difference. For me, it was still the same type of work, working very closely with hiring managers, creating added value wherever necessary. I don't know if I realized a very, very big difference. I think later on, once I grew, I started to understand a little bit more about, of course, there are power dynamics. There is a certain unspoken hierarchy. Even if you have very written rules, we can get into that more. But ultimately, it took me a while to get to that point of like, this is a bit of a different environment once you go past the actual task of doing recruitment or the missions that you have.
And it's very
Okay.
interesting that you're saying about, because I also worked in London, and I experienced the same culture of thinking that agency recruitment is cooler than being in-house. After I moved to Amsterdam, I didn't really notice the same culture as there. But there, indeed, agency recruiters are kings.
They are. And it's fun, to be honest, especially when you're a bit younger. For me, it was also on purpose. When I moved from Romania to Dublin, I was like, I need to work in an agency because I don't know anything about the market. So if I go straight into an internal role, I will just know that particular company with that particular, let's say, environment. And I will not learn fast enough. For me, it was a bit of a strategic move to just like, I need this as my boot camp into Irish ecosystem because I knew nothing.
And then did you know that the second step would be to go in-house and then to explore other countries, or it was more, let's take it one at a time and see how it goes?
It was a little bit take it once at a time. The thing is, when you move somewhere, let's not speak about others, but when I moved somewhere, you have an idea about that particular place when you move, and then you have another idea in a couple of years, right? You evolve in your awareness of yourself. What do you like? What do you prefer? And back then, I think at some point it got a little bit tiring to be on an island. That was one of the biggest principles, to be honest, because I had to take a plane for everything, like going on holiday, going home. You can't drive, you can't take a train, and I love this optionality, right? So it was a bit. It came to a moment where like, which place would it be similar in terms of like work culture, opportunities, standard of living, but with more mobility. In Amsterdam, it was. I met somebody at an SRE conference in Dublin. And when I decided to move, I reached out to all my, let's say, network of engineers that I made through this type of conferences or recruitment per se. And one of them was like, well, we have a team lead role in booking. I'll refer you. And that's how I ended up in booking.
Oh, that's so nice. Always one step leads to another in this case. And I think
Always,
this was
always.
2000, early 2010 or something, even
Yeah.
before.
Even, no, later. I think 16 or something like that.
Still, I think golden days for Booking.com.
Yes.
And so Booking.com facilitated your move to Amsterdam. And when you came here, was it what you expected? Was it better or not?
To be honest, I had a bit of imposter syndrome, right? Because while I was working with Facebook, which was already a large organization, and we had super interesting projects back then, I did management in Romania, where I was fairly young, but the agency was running very well, and apparently I did an enough good job that they said, "Hey, here's a team of 5 people, take care of them." But then I had a break, right? I had to go back to individual contributor when I moved to Dublin. And then somebody at Booking gave me the vote of trust to say, hey, you do have the skills. Maybe you have this gap in, let's say, team leadership, but here's a team of 5 people, do some mobile development, recruitment, and then we'll see. And I must say, it was a bit nerve-wracking if Eugenia or Marlena are listening to this, who were in my team, and then they grew themselves and they're like brilliant talent members now of the Amsterdam community. I felt I really had to prove myself, because the recruitment we were doing in Meta was quite paced. They had a little bit of a better planning and structure, and Booking was in hyper growth. So there
And also
was
a bigger brand, right? That also helps.
yeah, European, right? So exactly, right? So when you say, hey, you want to work at Facebook, everybody's like, yes. In Booking, I think it was still not there yet. I think now it is a big engineering brand. But at the beginning, it was like, well, you have a travel website. What do you need 1,200 engineers per year?
Yeah.
But also I was working more with, I would say, bigger teams. When I joined Booking, I think we were about 20, and then by the time I left in about 3 years, we were 120, just technical recruiters, right? And then the leadership team. And they were already quite well-established team leads, and I was not necessarily a native speaker. I think the others were. I felt a bit intimidated, I must say, but they gave me a chance and they let me prove myself, and then it went well.
When it comes to, I really like the point you made with Eastern European countries being more on the nurture side, and then Dublin, probably Western European, but not all of them being more on the sales side when it comes to hiring or recruitment. How did you find Amsterdam in that regard? Was it one or the other or something else?
A good compromise. What do you think? I think it has a bit, because I didn't feel, even working with a lot of agencies there, I didn't feel they were like, if you as a client, because I was more on the client side, right? So if me as a client, I was like, hey, I don't need an agency now. Maybe later, I don't have the budget for this, yada, yada. I think in general, or in Dublin, or maybe in London too, they would just drop you. They would forget about you. If you said no, I was like, okay, next client. But I think in Amsterdam, I experienced behaviors from agencies and agents that were a little bit more nurturing. So I worked a lot with Orange Quarter, for example, which is, I would say, quite an established brand now in Amsterdam, with a couple of other brands who kind of kept pinging me in a good way, right? Because I was on the other side, and I was like, yeah, this is the type of agency that I'm looking for, because I know when the hard time is for me, they will be there, right? And vice versa eventually. So yeah, maybe a bit in the middle.
It makes me think that the bigger, geographically speaking, and also the bigger the market, the more prone to sales. Look at the UK, look at probably the US as well. And the smaller it is, the more people know and companies know each other, and the more prone to nurturing. And I think there is a saying that Amsterdam is a big village, or the Netherlands in general.
Yes.
So that's why I think there's more commonality from my perspective with the nurture culture.
True.
And I'm curious, as at Booking, you became a manager. I'm curious, what's your advice for individual contributors that then have their first position as team lead, or how should they grow into a team lead? I'm curious to hear your opinion about this.
I will share an advice I got myself from somebody who was manager there, and I took it to heart, and it was a little bit shocking, to be honest, at the beginning. It's nothing crazy, but you don't really think about this, or I didn't much. He said, whatever you've done so far won't take you further in a way. So it was like what you did until now took you up to here. What you do from now on will take you to the next step. And by that meaning, I think as an individual contributor, we are, especially in recruitment, you solve problems, whether they are recruitment process, talent attraction, some employer brand, maybe you do some other stuff on the side, but ultimately you focus on a problem. Switching to manager or to leader, it was very important for me to intentionally dedicate time to solve people problem. So let's say I have a new member in the organization. I need to make sure they are like brilliantly onboarded if I want them to be happy and integrated and create the right value. If I have people who maybe don't really like what they're doing, can I find stuff for them to do? It's my job to open those doors. So there's more around understanding the rest of the ecosystem versus the market or the problem in your face. For me, this was a bit of a realization point that my job fundamentally changed. Conceptually, it's the same, solve problems, but I'm not solving the problem for the hiring team. I'm solving the problem for the team that I maybe am responsible for or I'm trying to help. And you can do this formally and informally. I think those we had also in general, I think you would see there is a 6 months, 9 months, maybe a year's time where people observe you. You start doing things, whether you want it or it comes natural to you. It depends. I wanted it, like I really wanted to grow in the leadership side. And they observe you a bit outside the performance review cycles and the principles and whatever. Like, do they have this interest to keep going no matter the issue that is thrown at you? Because there's a resilience when it comes to people in general, and you need to like people, and I like people a lot.
Nice, yeah. And now you have results through people and not through your own actions necessarily, and you need to create that platform for them to be successful.
And you need to let go. You really need to let go, right? Like you can't be in every room. It doesn't help anybody for you to tell them what to do, but it helps them telling them when maybe they're missing something or encouraging them moving forward, or recognizing them in front of peers or in front of their hiring managers. There's this ecosystem that is created by you making space.
I like that approach. And I think it rings a bell oftentimes, regardless of the size of the company or the size of the team, because it's the same mind shift. And I think you're referring to what got you here won't get you there type of approach. And it's really hard because you've been doing the same thing, you got really good at it as an individual contributor, and then you're just plunging into the unknown. Of course, there are mentors and support systems, but it's a mind switch.
And you're not throwing anything in the garbage. I think there's this feeling that you need to also shed a part of what you've learned and kind of, give up on all that investment and probably, stress that you've built through that. But it's not. It's always going to come in handy. It's part forever of your toolbox. It's never going away. It's just not priority. It's just not in the spotlight anymore. You need to start growing other plants.
We see this a lot with engineers that we talk to.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them realize after a year or maybe less that it doesn't give them energy or it's not what they expected. So they prefer to go back to being individual contributors, which is totally fine. There's career progression steps to be made there as well. But the only way to know is to actually give it a try.
And I must say, there are not many companies who give you that option.
True.
I think we must be honest here. Not a lot of organizations have the maturity to say, oh, you failed at management, go back to team lead and you're going to be like totally fine to advance. A lot of the times is not the case. So I think if you want to take this step, and I've seen this also in recruitment, and I've had recruiters who, after a couple of years, they were like, hey, maybe I want to do something else. I'm like, okay, let's look into it. I had somebody who went into data analyst, and I think now they moved to creative, creative design. Somebody who moved into technical project management, they just committed some time and we helped them there. Employer brand, of course, and a lot of other tangential HR functions. I think it's important to put yourself in organizations, in ecosystems where you can have that choice, because then it's easier to try. Otherwise, it is risky, to be honest, especially in this market.
Yeah, I want to continue the path you had in terms of, moving geographically. So after Amsterdam, if I remember correctly, you moved to Paris, right?
Correct.
Another shift, but still probably not as much in terms of,
Ooh, no, it was the biggest
differences.
shock.
Oh yeah, all about it. Tell me all about it.
Super interesting. I think I was searching for, let's say, the next step in my career, really managing the entire team and having more scope and working directly with C-level. And this opportunity came. I had one question for them when they made me the offer. I'm like, are you sure? Because I don't speak French. And while it is a global company, it has offices in France and the US. The culture is still very French, right? So I was quite wary about that. They said, yes, 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 we want to push more, international culture. We want to push more for people to speak English. And I'm like, sure, let's go. I think for me, it was super interesting because it was such a special project. It was specifically intended for us to build an AI lab, one of the very few in Europe, especially back then. We were hiring researchers, we were hiring applied machine learning scientists. We were like a lot of, let's say, things that now are like, oh, super hot. And it was a very different type of recruitment because this ecosystem of data scientists, computer scientists, PhD researchers, and all that, they exist in a very different space than normal engineers, let's say so. We were participating in a lot of very closed conferences, paper research, sponsored by universities in general, both in the US and in France. And it was super interesting, to be honest, to get that done. But ultimately, Paris is a massive city, is super interesting if you have a lot of money. So if you are a recruiter who's looking to move to Paris because they saw Emily Paris or it's charming, or you have some historical thinking about that, I think it is definitely worth it, but you need to be aware of, you need to speak French. We were working with a lot of international folks, but they were speaking French. And I was kind of dabbling, and I could read, Romanian is very similar, so it was not a disaster. But I did sense many times, especially with people in my own team, we had to make some very early agreements, like what is the level of the understanding of the language, right? Like some people are like, you need to speak slower because I can't follow. I'm like, I get it, great. I'm here to help you, so I'll do whatever it takes. But it's just a different environment. And I think when it comes to work culture, especially with leadership team, there are very interesting aspects that I learned, but I also I read the culture map once a year from Erin Meyer. It is a quite a relevant book when it comes to understanding communication styles and decision-making styles and feedback styles. And I organized very quickly sessions with the teams around how do we give feedback to each other, having in mind the multicultural team we are becoming. They were mostly French when I arrived, and we diversified, and we added Polish, we added German, we added British. It became more diverse, and that was a good thing for the organization, but it's a process that you need to help to have people kind of collaborate and communicate effectively. But it was a difficult environment for me because work was great, but then social life was not so great. Like while at work, people would have to speak English. They wouldn't need to speak English when outside, right? So I would go out with my team, and after half an hour, and rightfully, again, I don't have any grudges or anything, but it's just a fact, right? It's just so easy to talk in your native language when most of the people in the group are native, right? So it was a big transition, but I'm in general curious and flexible, but I think it's just not as easy as Amsterdam or Dublin, of course.
Yeah, I had the same experience. I worked for a French company, and even, you go to team meetings and then the overall English level is everywhere. It's still like the moment there's, oh, you're French as well, boom, let's talk French, because it makes sense, right?
It makes
And
sense.
And also I noticed, so when I first left Romania, I moved to Germany to work at DHL. And I used to work in ISEC, which with Andre, which was a student organization
Yeah.
to facilitate exchanges between countries for students. And I thought I know almost everything about, cultural shocks, cultural differences, especially within Europe. I mean, how much can I still be surprised? And when I moved to Germany within the first couple of weeks, I was like, oh my God, this is way more intense than I expected, or all the books that I read, or all the stories that I heard, because you live it versus, just reading about it. So I think to a certain extent I can empathize, but only to a certain extent.
I can also add an example here, as I worked for 2 years in London, and then I moved to Amsterdam, and the cultures are extreme opposites. In London, I needed to really pick up what people were trying to say while they weren't saying it. And in the Netherlands, then I got accustomed to the direct communication, which was very, well, the change made for me very shocking, because I was used to understanding the subtleties of British communication, and in the first few months, I took it very personally. Everything that they would say, that for them would be normal. So it's very interesting. How are French people in that regard in terms of communication? Are they direct, or?
I think they can be direct, but not in the directness that Dutch or German might have, in a more humor, sarcastic way.
Okay.
A bit more like Romanians.
Okay, nice.
And then after Paris, you realize, okay, time to make another change. And then Berlin called, or it was again serendipity?
Berlin called.
Mhm.
Again, a bit of a referral, right? So I think at the beginning of my career, I didn't really appreciate the strength of some connections you make, or even the weak ties. There's this network theory,
Yes, Reid
and
Hoffman speaks a lot
yeah,
about it.
right. And you're like, wow, okay, I know this person who knows this person, and they know, and they heard about me, and they heard about something, and we should talk, right? And it was a little bit like that. There was a very interesting opportunity with Zalando. They were going through a whole reorganization and so on. And to be honest, I wasn't really ready to move or anything like that, but Zalando is still a very important brand, and Berlin was interesting enough for me to explore. So I had some conversations, and I remember very well, I think she's still there. I think she's actually VP of people now, but back then she had a smaller function, and I admired her. Like, I knew about her from LinkedIn. I was quite close to the McKinsey kind of publications, and I was reading everything. I was eating everything up, and I was like, oh my God, I can work with people like that. It matters to me. It matters to kind of be in places where I will learn from others. And then I met some other people through the interview, and my former manager, Soren Winter, who is a personality in the talent and tea world, especially in Germany, but I think even wider. And again, I was impressed. So I was kind of, in the candy shop. This is too good. And then pandemic hit. So somehow Paris at that point was extremely strict. It was bad. It was really bad. And we took, with my partner, we decided to just not be there. I think by these two considerations, Zalando was a very interesting opportunity for me, but also the pandemic kind of rushed some things. I think when it comes to that, I think it was a good decision at the end of the day. But I didn't stay a long time in Zalando. This manager that I'm talking about, Soren Winter, moved to Wayfair, and then he pulled me in there after 6 months. Soren is very good at that. I think he's the best connector I've ever seen, and I learned a lot from him. But that's a little bit my transition to Berlin at that point.
This is something I want to dive a bit into. And I think what you were referring at the beginning of your sentence was the theory of 6 degrees of separation, which is the idea that everyone is one way or another 6 people away from each other, from knowing each other. And one pattern that I see in most of your, let's say, steps geographically moving around is leveraging your network. I'm not sure exactly to which extent you did it consciously, but I'm curious if you can take us a little bit through how you do that. How do you keep in touch with people? How do you map them out? How do you think of this kind of stuff? Because some people have a personal CRM, you hear that. Some people I don't do that. I just, open WhatsApp and just keep scrolling. How do you nurture and make use of it?
I want to say I have a very sophisticated system. I try this. I mean, I have a Notion page somewhere with like 6 contacts because I was like, I need to kind of start automating this. Didn't work out for me. I am not that organized, but there are a couple of ways for me that were important, and I didn't necessarily have a plan to keep in touch with people, but I follow those who maybe can create knowledge for me first. So it's not so much about like the relationship or the opportunity, but just being close enough to see what they're doing, how they're doing, getting inspired. And if I have a question, I ask, right? I do a conscious effort to reach out if I have a question or an idea, and sometimes nothing comes out of that, but a lot of the times it comes back to you. So there is a conscious effort to continuously expand the network, and I'll tell you because this comes from a bit of a trauma. Back in Romania, my second year of recruitment, I was working in a tiny agency. They created an office there, and there were 2 people, me and another person. And after a year, they realized I was basically recruiting engineers from Romania to move. It was before Romania entered the EU, to go to Czech Republic, Poland, France, whatever, right? Brain drain, working on that. And within a year, they said, hey, we don't want to stay in Romania, have the office in Romania, but we want to keep you. Do you want to stay with us? I was in university. I loved what I was doing. I was making very good money for that period. And I was working part-time, heaven. So I was like, yes, I'll do it. I'll stay. I'll work from home. No problem. And I worked 9 months from home when I was 20 something. And at the end of those 9 months, I was like, this is insane how much my network has shrunk just by working from home, and my ability to also socialize and connect is worse. So I made somehow a bit of a pledge to myself back then that no matter the work environment, because I was like, hey, we work in distributed teams, we will not be in person, maybe I'll not work in big offices and so on, but I made a little bit of a pledge to continuously utilize the networks like the LinkedIn's and whatever to grow this type of I call it as a knowledge base, right? Like whatever somebody else knows, maybe I can borrow at some point. I'm looking at your books now, Daniel. I'm like, we're gonna be friends. So I think for me, it was a bit of a conscious effort to expand this network, at least the digital network. Second, somehow I made an effort. If I do something right, or if I build a career in this space, I was a bit maybe scared of this sometimes Romanian attitude of my work will speak for me.
Yep.
Right?
I see that in my with my girlfriend. I need to coach her to not have that mentality. So I understand completely what you're saying.
Like I need to make sure that people know what I'm doing. And then I don't need to do much, right? Like I just do a good job, but I need to also make sure that people know about the good job that I'm doing. So I still keep the ethical part of performing, delivering, whatever that is, but I do not expect for that work to speak for me. That is something that traditionally has not worked, and especially for women.
Yeah.
So I make a bit of a conscious effort to be present online, to tell people, like, being on this type of experience, I'm not necessarily different or stronger or anything, but I am here to help. So when people need my help, then they call me.
I like that. I like that approach. And I'm curious also, one step before that, when you mentioned that you decided to leverage your LinkedIn around a specific topic, if you can give an example. Because there's one thing that I understand, but I'm just curious what you have in mind and how, based on a specific topic, how do you gravitate people around that?
I do DEI consulting now, and I do my own work with clients, which is a very recent thing and a very scary thing, to be honest. But if you go in my posts on LinkedIn, you will see that from 2014, 15, you will see maybe 4, 5, 6 articles, 2 conferences, contributions on others on the topic. Like, I was like, this is my topic. This is something that I care about. This is something that I continuously educate myself about. This is something that I experience through different, work scenarios or projects that we do. Can we share this? Can we make this a shareable type of asset, right? And then this is how, from this type of articles, I was very itchy to do a podcast like you are doing now, which is called We Include, and I interview founders of businesses for good. And then from there, I have demand to actually create other type of interventions. So there's a thread that I chose. Of course, for a very long time, it was technical recruitment. How do you recruit engineers? How do you attract engineers? I love this part of employer branding, brainstorming creative ideas, creating programs, internal mobility, referrals, everything that had to do with TA, right? Like I'm genuinely passionate about it. And I think people, especially when they enter the industry, they want to know things that happen now. Like, you can read books, you can have the hiring success that is behind me, and I can go through it 3 times, but it will not really tell me what's happening today and how should I operate within my own space. So if I do SRE recruitment, or if I do mobile, or if I do AI recruitment, I kind of want to hear from those folks who are doing the same thing. So I kind of started creating some content around that. And I think at work, I always had opinions. So it's not that I was very loud per se. I think they're much louder people than I am. But I asked a lot of questions that didn't go well a lot of times. And I learned how to be balanced as well. And I was helped. I got nice and productive and constructive feedback from my managers. When is it too much? When is it maybe not enough? I learned to, I'm still learning, but cultivating this is a continuous, it needs to be continuous. I don't want to be, I don't want to say consistent, because I started hating this word when it comes to social media. I'm like, oh, you need to be consistent. Like, I'm not a consistent person, but I am there. I'm there, even if I'm not there.
You mentioned one point around the trends, specifically around hiring and talent attraction in general. And I'm curious, from a perspective of someone that has lived in 6 different countries and specifically doing talent acquisition in 6 different countries, different company sizes, what do you see as trends right now happening in talent acquisition? And I'll leave it very broad on purpose.
Ooh, trends are funny, right? There are good trends and bad trends. Okay, so
Let's
I'll
do
speak
2
about
and 2.
Yeah, I'll do the bad trend that I see at the moment, and maybe I'm wrong. It's just a very random observation. But with these layoffs and with this maybe instability or shrinkage of the market, especially in tech recruitment, I can't speak too much about the rest, to be honest. I've witnessed a going back to local language trend. I've seen organizations, especially in Germany, even a bit in the Netherlands, France, of course, but like posting in the local language, the job ads, which was not really common. And also recruiters putting very specifically in there, when they do a little bit of advertising, oh, I'm looking for this person with this language. And I think for a lot of jobs is relevant. Like, I've recruited for jobs or my teams where like you need the language, right? Because you're developing a certain product for a certain market, yada, yada. But a lot of the times it's not necessary, right? So I think it's more of a weird nationalism translated into corporate world. I don't know how to call it, but I don't necessarily think it's a good thing. That's why I'm putting it in the bad basket. Other trends which I think will happen after this period more is I think in the past 2-3 years, most of the organizations had a lot of budget, they had a lot of like plans, and they hired a lot of recruiters internally. I think this is shifting with going back to agency work and embedded and project work. I think it is correct to do that. I would do the same if I didn't have a clear horizon of what my budgets are in the next 2-3 years. I would also go for like short-term solutions or creating some creative combinations. I've always worked involving all these parties to maximize the hiring I can do for my organizations. So I think that's a trend that will continue to grow. Those agencies which manage to stay alive during this period and pivot and create value, I think they will really get another boost again when things restart.
That makes total
I don't
sense, by
know.
the way.
Yeah.
Intuitively, that makes sense, and not because in a way we're on this side as a freelancer, but I think specifically for that reason, which is when you don't know, you have a limited budget and you don't know how the next 6 to 12 months would look like, you kind of mitigate risk and play with the same card, which is let's hire someone that we can switch on and off whenever needed, that is ready to go in right away, no onboarding, long-term learning curve. And that's why I think not only in recruitment, I think in general, I see a tendency as well. So that rings a bell.
And I just, maybe this is also because I have this area of visibility a bit clearer. When all this mayhem started about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, there was a big speech around DEI fatigue, for example, right? And me, I was just deciding to go full on DEI. And a lot of people were like, are you crazy? Like, nothing is happening for, DEI, forget about it. This is not true. The conversations I'm having, the client calls I'm having, it's very interesting because there is a bit of a breather and we're not like going crazy for hiring and a million projects at the same time. The organizations I'm talking to, and these are more, let's say, small and medium, maybe it's a bit different in large organizations, we've really paused a lot of stuff now. They're taking the moment to analyze how to best hire when things restart. So there is audits that we're doing, there is process definition, there is inclusive language that people work on. There's so many things around the idea of DEI in the hiring process and beyond that is much more sought for now when things are a bit quieter.
There's probably at least another episode length that we could use to talk about this topic. I'm curious, to also make the most of what we have here and now. So imagine I'm a part of a startup / scale up that I'm starting to think more and more about DEI, and specifically, how do I implement it for the first time, or what are the top 3 things that I should look at, or the 20% that brings 80% of the result? What do you advise normally something like this to embed it in the hiring process?
I did not prepare this answer, but I am always prepared with this answer. There are some very interesting maybe ways to look at DEI in an organization, like with everything. Take marketing, take sales. There is a maturity cycle. You do things on a spreadsheet in marketing and you post the assets, or you do sales by picking up the phone. That's one way of doing sales, and you're still doing sales, right? It's just a very reactive, maybe non-automated way. The same is with DEI. We have, I would say, 3 main steps. We have the reactive area where you're like, well, my candidates are asking for it, my current employees are asking, what are we doing on DEI? Or there is an incident, right? Like George Floyd that generated so much movement when it comes to race inclusion. We have some similar things happening in France, and maybe in France now there is more attention to that. We have things that are happening in Poland when it comes to abortion rights and women's rights. So there are also some contextual societal things that may make organizations react. So that's the reactive model. Then maybe you're like, hey, I want to get an ATS that does language verification, does bias verification, does some extra stuff. That's a bit of a proactive, like you're making a particular investment to maybe protect yourself or solve a certain problem that you might have seen. So there is some proactivity there. And then I would say we move into this model where it's strategic. It's actually embedded in everything you do related to the human and employee journey within that organization. My advice is think of 3 things if you are a new founder or somebody, a new head of talent. One is the leadership commitment. who from the leadership group will stay with you when shit hit the fan. Sorry, we can blip that. But when good things happen and when bad things happen, there's somebody in the leadership team that needs to be there with you, for you, carrying the DEI message. So that's one. Two is a bit education, enablement of your teams, the TA team, the HR team, the compensation and benefits team, the employer brand team, whatever team touches anything around the employee journey, educate them on DEI. Language, what are some issues regular, what are the biases more regular in this environment, so many things. I know we're out of time. So the third one is tooling. So leadership, enablement, and tooling. Make sure you can augment all these initiatives with the right tooling, whether it's your ATS or your CRM or the social media scheduling, whatever you're using. There's so many things coming up now. It would be a shame not to look into them at least. So these three things for me would be key if you want to start on the journey.
I have
Very
this
fast.
is a great, yeah. Maybe we're talking about the same thing. You go ahead.
Maybe. What I'm really curious about is, especially in small startups where speed is of the essence, how do you get buy-in from leadership to hire and to do diversity, equity, and inclusion, and not just hire, the best and the fastest?
I think I'm trying to read between the lines. You're saying to me that people would be reluctant, that group would be reluctant by default. Because sometimes it happens that people are just like, the CTO, like I know a few CTOs like that who go into a new company and they're like, what are we doing for, gender diversity or intersectionality, or how are we creating opportunity? So let's assume it's a more reluctant type of group. You need to convince them that time is just, that time wastes time in quotes here. If they're like, oh, we're hiring too slow because we're looking for this and that, you need to convince them that it's worth it. And there are many ways to do that, whether it's the research that you can bring, whether it's some A/B testing that you can do for periods of time, right? Like, or take smaller teams to prove the concept that you're trying to propose there. Because things will accelerate. But indeed, to create awareness, are we going in the right communities? Are we creating the right nurturing groups? Are we having the right language? Are we attractive enough, right? Like, maybe I'm not offering enough information about my benefits or about anything that I'm doing to attract people from diverse backgrounds. Are we creating psychological safety? There's so much, but basically the convincing piece can have depending on who's in front of you, I have three directions. One, if you're talking to the CFO, talk money. There's research there that the bottom line is really helped when you have people from diverse backgrounds working on your product or your services. If I'm talking to the technical folks, they usually want products that serve more users. There's a very strict correlation with making your products better by having the right people working on them. This is why Google, this is why other large organizations are so successful. So there is an argument when it comes to the type of product. And then there's more the human part, where I don't want to forget the emotion that people have if you can connect to maybe experiences they had of discrimination. I've had quite a few experiences, which is good and bad. I think people who will listen to this will be on both sides. But I had some men in high positions of power in tech groups when they had a daughter born, and it was the first year, and maybe they also had a boy. And then they started seeing the very, very systemic not discrimination, but stereotyping of the little daughter versus the little son. And they were like, oh, I want to make sure that, when my daughter will be of age to work, there are inclusive workplaces. So you will find allies through these reasons eventually: money, quality product, or just the emotional connection.
Yeah, I also have an example like that where there were much more benefits for parents after C-level people became parents.
And a lot of people would be like, oh, they should be allies, or they should be inclusive, no matter, you have kids,
Yes.
you don't have kids, and all that. I don't have kids, so it doesn't necessarily need to be a pretend. But I'll take whatever,
Sure,
to be honest.
sure.
I have a very specific example as well when I hear you talk. It's something that I often encounter as a situation with some clients that I work with. So it goes like this. They start hiring usually for a technical role. Could be leadership, could be individual contributor, doesn't really matter. And they say, we would like to prioritize women for this role because our tech team is almost 100% men. And we know the added value it would bring, and we're willing to make efforts to do this. So please, also as a proactive reach out and sourcing and whatever tooling you need and have, please go ahead and prioritize women. So we take the time, proactively source women, talk to women. Some of them good, some of them not, but statistically speaking, there are just not that many that fit the profile. So they're not willing to sacrifice the technical skills for that. And then in the end, they end up, with, let's say, 80% men in the late stage of the pipeline, maybe 10, 20% women. And then in the end, obviously, again, statistically speaking, the chances are to select someone is higher from a larger pool. So in the end, they select a man and they say, well, at least we tried. And that's pretty much where it ends. Then we look back, okay, how we could have done better. Well, the conclusion most of the time is, well, there weren't that many. And the ones that were, compared to the level of skill that we were looking for, men scored higher. And that's how they sleep better at night, basically. So how do you, if you encounter something like this, how do you approach it?
Different ways, maybe. Again, a whole different podcast episode, but I'll tell you a little bit the conversations or
Just
things
the
that
hook,
work.
for the next.
Yeah. Some things that eventually worked. One, what is it most important for the team? To have yet another super strong, whatever my principle is of that, or to make better products, right? Like if your idea of creating value for the organization, it's simply on skill level, I think we just need to revise that grid of competencies, skills, behaviors that we're searching for. We're searching for smart, high potential folks in general. And I think this was the switch that I seen in organizations that managed to move the needle. They not that they disregarded that piece of paper where you have 10 skills that you need to score 9.5 on, but they augmented it with what does this person bring on top of the technical skills, if we're talking tech folks. So I think there was a bit of an awakening in general of the multiple dimensions and also potential that people have, and how my teams are being transformed when I add people from diverse backgrounds, with diverse perspectives, with experiences, with input. And I'll give you a very clear example here. If you see now some products that you could say, this is interesting. And a very dear example to me is bookings checking. Let's say there's a small tick that they do, but when you check certain locations, certain accommodations, they have a safety check. And this safety check is specifically for women traveling solo or LGBTQ communities, especially when you're in countries that are not very friendly to LGBTQ communities. And this type of safety check was designed because we started having women and people from the LGBT community in the product teams who said, we can make this product better if we add this feature, because their lived experience added somehow perspective to what people search, right? Or what people need. So there is maybe a trial and error to figure out what is that argument, what is that concept that will weight even a little bit more than just those 10 tech skills, right? I'm not saying hire worse people than your regular rank, but you never really hire people just on a specific level. Everybody has a certain, there is a range there.
Yeah,
Yes.
And it tends to be polarized quite black and white, basically. So if it's not this, then it means we're compromising on quality, which no one wants. So therefore, I like it. And I think it's really important to have more good case practices in, this company did this approach and this is how it turned out.
Yeah.
I don't know
Yes.
if there's a list of, I'm just thinking out loud while you were talking, like if there would be a list of different company sizes in different countries doing it right or with some good case practices, that'd be a pretty handy thing to make use of.
Maybe we'll create that, but there are some, I don't want to say it doesn't apply to everybody, but there are some books. For example, there is a book called Invisible Women, and there are hundreds probably of examples in that book around like when women join some project or some type of workforce or some parts of industry, things change for the better for everybody. This is also what I realized very early on. Somehow when you build for those who need more accessibility, or there is a certain different ways to build, it actually benefits more people. There's the classical example with the seatbelt. For decades, the cars that were being built were tested only with the seatbelt of male mannequins. So the weight and the height were always the same, and that generated a lot of more grave or deadly accidents for women and children. And only last year, this is shocking, only last year, a Swedish company made the first kind of women's size or alternative size for testing seatbelts in this type of context, like producing car manufacturers. These things need to have an intent behind. Like when you say I want to have more diverse teams, I think in general you need to understand there will be different outcomes to how you do things, but you also need to be prepared to not necessarily accept, but adopt these different backgrounds, right? Like you can't say, oh, let's hire more people from this background and then not do anything to change the internal culture. That doesn't work either. Like I've seen sexism, we've all seen homophobia. There are many issues that people don't want to go through if they're not in the right space. So there is work to do, sequential, right? Like if I've decided to expand my view as a team or as an organization, and I start incorporating people from diverse backgrounds, I also need to be prepared for them. Like I need to understand that there will be different communication styles, there will be different conflict styles, there will be different feedback styles. How do I bring people together? And this is super interesting conversation. It sounds sad or bad, but it's just so fascinating and interesting in general. So don't, like, those listening, it's like any other complex problems, and we like solving complex problems, right?
Yeah, definitely. It's a step-by-step approach. And with this hook, basically, I wanna, pause it here because we're probably gonna do a part 2. Let's see. But yeah, so I don't know, Andre, do you have anything else you wanted to? Because for me, this was pretty much.
A lot. I have a lot more things to say, but I will not. I will leave it for part 2 because it sounds like we should have a part 2. It was really interesting to talk with you, Oana. I like your self-reflection, and also part of part 2 would be of how you do that. But it was great talking with you. Thank you for being on our podcast, and talk to you soon.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you once again. And we'll do the intro, outro thing.